We'll move on then to ethics literacy, which is Dom Henri, University of Hull, and Ruth Healey, University of Chester.
Oh yeah. Well, I assumed everyone would be happy to have a bit of a break from me talking, but obviously. Um, so I think everybody knows who I am, and Ruth, you were able to introduce yourself earlier. Um, this talk came about because we were thinking about examples of competency that we could use that were like particular examples of some of the problems with the competency-based approach, or some of the advantages, and particularly these ideas around, um, particularly these ideas sort of stemming from the graduate attributes literature, where we have these big ideas about what we want university to develop. We want university to develop independent learners, engaged citizens, and they're things that are often part of graduate attributes framework. So universities sort of are very behind the idea that students are developing these things, but then often it's not very clear what the evidence that a graduate has developed any of the graduate attributes are, or where it is within the curriculum that they are being developed. And this is sort of, and this was some work that Ruth had done. I can't remember when the paper was, Ruth. A few years ago, around building ethics and ethical thinking. So it's a sort of opportunity to think about some of the advantages and the challenges associated with the competence-based model. So if we have this idea of competence as knowing, doing, and being, ethics or being ethical is fundamentally more about knowing what your legal obligations are, knowing what the moral thing is to do in any situation. In order to be ethical, inherently requires action. It inherently requires, well, in any context, Carolyn. So, and I think this is part of the thing, sort of one of the things we've been talking about in all of these different contexts. So, an example within biosciences is, we know about the legal responsibilities for dealing with animal welfare, but they don't always necessarily align with different ethical perspectives on what animal welfare is. So what your legal responsibilities to look after an animal are often less than what societal expectations are that we should look after animals. And that there's some really interesting things there to explore, to think about, well, how do students navigate those ethics and those ethical decisions in their personal and their professional lives after they graduate? And is it possible for a university course to actively develop that? Are people ethical or not? Is it something that can be taught or learned? We know that students can learn about ethical frameworks and legal responsibilities, but does that necessarily increase the likelihood that they would act in an ethical way? So particularly thinking about sort of one of those really common things that we see. It's one of the fundamental 4 values that was sort of presented in the I can't remember the name of the a review of higher education. There were 4 fundamental things, and one of which was the development, the Robbins principle. One of which was the development of informed and engaged citizens. And this is a supposed value of higher education, is that it increases ethical citizenship. But the question would be, where is that within the course? And we can see this again, those of you guys who follow stuff like Retraction Watch, or we look in the news, we're seeing increasing scrutiny of research ethics. That the impact of the publish or perish mentality on our sector has resulted in the fabrication, the research misconduct, and So there are real world implications of ethics training. So for an example, when this, is this being evidenced or is this being developed within a course? Is it sufficient to say that a student who has passed all the way through the course without being done for misconduct has behaved in an ethical way, and that's sufficient to say that they will carry on behaving in an ethical way and that they have developed their ethics? Because often students' ethical reasoning isn't actively and specifically assessed within the course. So
I think this one's me, Del.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is you.
So building on what Dom's said there, I think we would argue that it should be more than just that students have not been caught undertaking malpractice or with an academic integrity issue in some capacity. And so, as Dom's already alluded to, some work that I started actually 15 years ago, so it's been going on for quite some time in terms of these ideas. Very much about thinking, well, what is it we want our students to be able to know? And it came about really from the sort of sense that a lot of ethics that we were doing at the time was very much sort of tick box exercise type things of, yes, you've done these things or you've done those things as part of research processes. And it wasn't really getting to what I saw as the core in terms of that sort of thinking about the issues that they are addressing and helping people to develop that. So Chris Rochester at Derby University now and I work together to have a kind of approach to thinking about, well, what was ethical thinking? What is this? And we argued that it's a component of ethics literacy and it's a particular type of critical thinking. So to discuss ethical issues, students require decision-making skills, they require the skills to understand and recognise moral issues, and they need the skills to consider and decide upon the solutions to the moral problems that they might face. And this could be moral problems within their discipline, it could be moral problems just in society in general, or issues that they're sort of dealing with, maybe in all sorts of contexts that they might be working in. So these elements of ethical thinking are contextualised within that broader skill of ethical thinking. I think the quote on screen summarises this nicely from Kant, which is that ethical learning is impossible without the development of critical reasoning. And as Bonnie and Lozano go on to say, and at the same time, critical reasoning is reinforced by the aspiration for justice and the independence sought by ethical learning. So it's this kind of aligned relationship between ethical thinking or ethics and thinking critically. So ethical development therefore occurs through the improvement of critical thinking skills in relation to the sorts of ethical issues that our students might be facing in the various different contexts in which they might be working. Wolf et al. Argues that critical thinking skills can give students the tools to understand what they are learning. And this ability relates to analytical, interpretation, inference, explanation, and evaluation skills. So ethical thinking requires these different skills, enabling students to monitor and, where appropriate, potentially even correct their moral reasoning because they are seeing it differently as they are thinking more critically about the issues that they are considering. Meaning that ethical thinking is very much about judging in a reflective way what to do and what to believe. So those students who have sort of limited, if we want to sort of call it ethical development, would consider reality to be very certain and something that has absolute answers. Whereas I think we're all very aware that the absolute answers are changing day by day and things are evolving and developing as we go forwards. And so learning to think ethically, to critically reflect on ethical issues, offers the opportunity for students to develop their understanding of ethical reality, recognising the complexities and uncertainties which are inherent within all sorts of areas and the whole sort of their lives. So that brought us to come up with this definition of ethical thinking. So ethical thinking involves these two elements. First, the ability to reflect upon one's own and others' principles and how these underlie their codes of behaviour. We're not about saying what is right and wrong. We're not trying to argue that this is a particular way you should be thinking. There are if you like, the rules of the discipline for some areas, or the legal frameworks for some disciplines, whereby there are rights and wrongs, as it were. But we want to go beyond that and thinking about what they believe and how that might reflect on other people, and how their behaviour might reflect in different ways, and so on. And so that second part is then to be able to critically analyse, interpret, infer, explain, and evaluate ethical issues, whilst recognising that such processes are situated within the lens of their own code of behaviour. So how you think about what you're doing and how you think about the issues are effectively your own positionality. So this focus on developing this competency of ethical thinking is therefore not about how students should think, but increasing their awareness of their decision making and helping them to understand the values that are underpinning that, why they're making those decisions, why it matters, or why they think that that's the right course of action, because that's then helping them to think about the different approaches they might need to adopt or might be preferable if, for example, their normal ways of thinking about things don't work within the problems that they might come across.
So, and I think to just sort of to reiterate that point, then I think a core component of ethics literacy as a competence is giving students tool sets on how to come to decisions. Increasing their awareness of their of the decision making process and the values that underpin those decisions, and then giving them the toolkit to resolve ethical problems themselves. And particularly as opposed to telling students how to think. And I think this is really, really important. This has gained prominence in a national level within this last year with the OFS guidance on protecting free speech. And the sort of the increasing calls around wokery and all of this kind of stuff in university. It's really important that when we discuss ethics, it's not coming at it from a position of, oh, this is the way to think, this is the way to approach it, but giving students the toolkit required to make the decisions themselves, and particularly that ability to reason through ethical issues by being able to look at problems from other people's perspectives. And I think that was a sort of something that came up really consistently in our conversations about this. So what does that look like within a course? So what two examples? Start with you, Ruth, and then I'll do one.
So the model that we used in Chester, and as you can see, it started a long time ago, was basically trying to embed it into discursive assignment, which was around tutorials. So it was a new activity within a tutorials-based module, which was based on ethical scenarios. And I should say these ethical scenarios were really about the student experience more than necessarily specifically disciplinary kinds of ethics. We covered the sort of disciplinary ethics within other kind of research context modules. But within this particular strand, it was more thinking about the kinds of issues that they might face as they were kind of going through their university studies. So it was integrated into this existing second year tutorials module, and the tutorial groups were about sort of 6 or 7 students. If you were here at the beginning of today, Jackie talked about how our modules at Chester used to run for 24 weeks in a sort of long, thin approach. And so these tutorials would go on for the whole of the year. Students would be in groups of 6 or 7 students together, the same students, the same tutor for the full year, and they'd meet every couple of weeks to have a conversation about a particular topic. And the ethical scenarios were kind of aligned with that. So every 2 weeks they'd get a new ethical scenario. And at the end of each tutorial, they'd have an opportunity to just have 5 or 10 minutes just to talk about that particular scenario and kind of get a sense of what different people were doing. And in the final tutorial of the module, those students then had the chance to really have a conversation about their ethical decisions overall, so they could reflect back on what they'd done, why they'd made those decisions, and how that was influenced by particular kind of ways of thinking. We also introduced them to sort of very basic kind of different approaches to thinking through ethical issues, to give them a sense of that there were different ways of doing things, and help them to think about, well, do you use this approach automatically? Do you use something else? And give them a chance to really sort of see that if, say, their normal kind of approach wasn't working for them, because in the context of whatever the scenario was, they didn't feel that their normal version, which was basically, for example, that the more people who benefited from this and the less people who didn't would work, then they had other tools that they could use, for example, what they saw as just in the context of that situation. So there was a standard reflection sheet for students to be able to note down their ideas that had 5 or 6 headings on there, so that they could kind of give some structure to what they're talking about, and it just enabled them to really think through it. But we also said for each of these scenarios, how much did they find it to be an ethical challenge for them? Because for some of the scenarios, particularly some of the earlier ones in the I think it was 8 different scenarios in total, some of them found it very straightforward. They had no issues at all. And then when we took them and had the conversations with the other students, then somebody was like, well, actually, I found that really difficult because of this. And so it helped them, again, see those different perspectives and those different ideas around this. So this pattern existed for, I think it was the last sort of, I think it's just stopped because the module has stopped partly due to the change in the academic framework that's happening. But for the period of time that we did the research, and if you're interested, there are a couple of articles there and the full references at the end. But overall, the marks for the ethics tutorial at the end of the academic year was consistently the highest tutorial mark for all of the tutorials for a number of years running. They were always in the 2-1 category, and they tended to be better because it enabled people to really think through and have these constructive arguments and discussions, which very much fitted the marking criteria, which I will show you in a moment. But the topic very much enabled students to present this argument from a particular perspective, but also I think they were more comfortable with the format by then as well, but they'd also gotten comfortable with the ideas of the different scenarios they were discussing to be able to talk those through. But if I perhaps just move on to the criteria just to show this. So this was a broader criteria for all the tutorials, so it had to be, it's kind of a bit generic in a sense because all the different topics they were covering in the tutorials. But it was based on the idea that they had the opportunity to give some preparatory notes, which I think they couldn't influence the grading of the tutorial itself by very much. I think it was we sort of set a limit of sort of, they did absolutely brilliant tutorial notes. They could get up to 5% extra in terms of their mark, but it couldn't take it. It wasn't going to make the major difference because it was considered to be an oral assignment. And so the core elements of what they were assessed on was around their understanding of the topic, their presenting of an argument, and then on the next slide. It was about their ability to communicate and then their interaction with others. And the interaction with others was particularly interesting in terms of with something like this, they could then be able to develop and broaden the perspective by asking others and really taking that lead in the discussion. And I'll leave it at that because I'm really not sure what time we're on now in terms of, because we're not on the original bit. So I'll pass over to
just on 3:05.
Yeah, don't worry, Ruth. There's more time if you want to continue chatting, but Dom, sorry, I keep over talking. You go on.
No, it's all right. I was just going to say, I keep looking at the schedule and then like realising the schedule's in the air, isn't it? So I think that the sort of one of the things that's come up consistently through this project is lots of different people looking at very similar problems in isolation over the last decade or so. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do with the talks is to try and provide bring these people together in multiple perspectives, the journeys that they've gone, and then try to sort of bring more people along. And my perspective on this from ethics is again, so from the position of conservation, and dealing with the history of colonialism in conservation, which is broadly considered within the field to underpin much of the biodiversity crisis that we face today. So I think this is a sort of a really important. We know from a sort of curriculum perspective, it's a really important thing that we have to engage the students with in order to we have to engage them with in order to improve conservation practice in a global and in a national context. And the reason for this is that there are, a number of patterns within within conservation that are repeated over and over and over around the sort of impact of colonial activities, changing livelihoods, and then dominating a global narrative around good and bad in conservation over the last couple of hundred years.
You're okay for time, Dom. I've been chatting with Sue, so I'm going to give you an extra 5 minutes that you can fill, or we can take some questions.
So I think a really important part of this is it's not virtue signaling. It's not a sort of hand wringing exercise. It's not about white guilt. The issue, these are things that need to be discovered, discussed, because they fundamentally underpin modern issues. And if we're going to come to solutions, that students need to be able to look at conservation perspectives, conservation issues from outside of their own perspective. If we're going to discuss the conservation of African elephants, then it's really important that part of that discussion includes people that live with African elephants, and it also includes conversations about how current human-wildlife conflict is triggered by land ownership practices that have resulted as a result of the colonial history of these areas. And this is a really important thing in my conversations with conservation employers, whether that's within the UK or internationally or abroad, being able to engage with stakeholders, being able to see problems from the perspectives of lots of different people who, not just from the people who are pro-conservation, but also from people who, have to earn a living through the land management, or lots of different people who have lots of different responsibilities for our environment, and bring them all together and help them engage. So I think it sort of really speaks to this idea of being able to view issues, being able to view issues from multiple perspectives, and bring these together to look at using that to develop a solution, and understanding how positionality influences our perspective on a problem. So this is reflected within the marking criteria. So the students are given an assignment where they need to recommend policy for the conservation of an ecosystem of their choice, and part of the marking criteria is showing within that policy document, within that policy brief, that they've considered the perspectives of multiple different people that live within that ecosystem as consider the perspectives of multiple different people, particularly people that live within that ecosystem, people that have to make a living from that, but also the colonial history or the history of that space, and how that is related to the problem as is. There's also aspects again about academic integrity in there, which again is sort of another facet of ethical thinking. But importantly, one of the things that we've done within this is, instead of trying to prove that a student has done something unethically, in terms of use of AI, what I've been doing is looking at it from an information literacy perspective. So if a student says, "Oh, well, I've gone and looked at this reference," I can go and read the reference and see whether it does in fact support those points, or obviously if it does in fact exist. And then instead of accusing a student of academic misconduct, I can say, well, your information literacy isn't up to scratch here, and we can reduce marks on that without necessarily having to prove what has or hasn't happened from an ethical perspective. So I think that sort of I'm a bit thrown because I keep thinking I need to go to time. Ruth sent across a really interesting paper that really helped and really interestingly reflects, I think, a lot of the stuff that we were discussing from quite a long time ago, very prescient. So, which was Ronald Barnett's paper on supercomplexity. But this idea that students are graduating into a rapidly changing environment, and where they'll need, the competence to be able to adapt and make rational and ethical decisions, in an environment where our grounding values and truths are changing, and the frameworks by which we understand the world are shifting. And I think ethical literacy, as articulated as a competence, will play an essential role in preparing students for this future. An essential aspect of competence, it's not just a skill or a performance, but a big part of that aspect of competence is the being. It's a fundamental shift in who our students are. There's a lot of talk about graduate attributes, but these aren't skills. They are an identity. And it's not about telling students who they are, but providing the tools and the opportunities they need to flourish and to make themselves who they want to be. And I think within that, again, there's place for approaches to be inherently based within different disciplines, and Ruth and I discussed some of the different approaches as a result of that human geography and sort of environmental science approach. And I think also as well, the reason this was really important for me was because when I'm teaching about conservation, I did an activity where I looked at who it was, whose perspectives I was teaching, and I saw that, particularly in that lecture on elephant conservation, I saw that the perspectives of the people who live with elephants was missing. And this is really important because what we say as lecturers about an issue matters. Students will inform ideas about truth and truth and reality from what we say. And I do think we do have it's really important for us to say, well, to present what we say as a position that should be engaged with criticality and not just something that should necessarily be taken at face value. So staff should be able to place their teaching into perspectives and be critically evaluated and not just considered the truth. I didn't know if Ruth wanted to add anything to the conclusions there. I don't know whether we've got any questions. You did a great job there, Dom. All right, cheers.
Thanks very much, you two. That was a really insightful chat.